This week, Oda revealed that he will be getting a new editor. The tradition he has is to change them every once in a while to keep the manga fresh and exciting. However, due to the massive popularity of One Piece in Japan, Oda has said, according to Sandman, that typically the people that become his editors are already massive One Piece fans, which automatically ends up compromising the objectivity of the position, because how objective can you actually be if you're a massive fan of One Piece and if you're a massive fan of Oda himself? Like, it would be very hard to give Oda constructive feedback if you think that everything he does is amazing. It's kind of like what happened to George Lucas, where due to the incredible financial success of the first 3 Star Wars films, the people that worked with him after that were kind of afraid to give him any kind of constructive criticism about what he was doing. So from what I understand, recently the editors have sort of adopted a more marketing-oriented role, where like they're kind of in charge of getting people hyped for stuff. So just to give you guys an idea, this last editor actually started working on the manga at the beginning of Onigashima. He started in June 2020, according to Library of O'Hara. And so just to give you an idea of what was going on in the story back then, June 2020, around that time is when Marco shows up in Wano, and it is also when Yamato gets introduced as well. This last editor was also the same one who said he cried after he read chapter 986, which of course is the chapter where Momonosuke declares who he is, and then it ends with the Tsunachi cry and Kaido getting jumped on. So that being said, with a new editor in charge, I'm going to use this opportunity to make a request. Could we pretty please get an update on Blackbeard versus Law? What happened with that? That being said, I do want to give credit where credit is due. So if this last editor, I believe his name is Mr. Takano, if he had the idea of incorporating cover page stories that feed into what's actually going on in the manga, I just have to say that I really appreciate that. I think that's a great idea. I wish Oda would have done this a lot sooner, but yeah, it just adds more weight to the cover story. So if that was an editorial bit of advice or an editorial tip, I think it's great. So of course, in this case, we have Vegapunk meeting the elders, which automatically connects to what Saturn said a couple of chapters ago about how he did meet Vegapunk some time ago, and that he really does think that it's regrettable that Vegapunk is now in a position where he has to be eliminated, according to the government. And speaking of that sense of regret, if you go back to the Robin flashback, before the Buster Call is initiated, we do get to see a panel of one of the Gorosei. And before he gives the order to start the attack, he does appear to seem conflicted about doing so. Because he's rubbing his forehead as if saying, like, this is kind of regrettable that I have to give this order. And it's kind of hard to tell in the anime episode who that elder is, but in the manga, it's abundantly clear that that Gorosei is Saturn. Now, the cover for volume 105 was recently revealed, and though I know it's pretty obvious that it's supposed to be a visual reference / updated version of the cover for volume 25, I was pleasantly surprised to see Carrot instead of Sengoku's goat in the middle of the Yonko. I want to believe that that's Oda's way of saying that he still hasn't fully forgotten about her. Now, given that the chapter is more intense setup than the chapter that we got last week, I really want to draw focus to a character that's been on my mind recently, because Oda has a track record of hinting at very important stuff through her character. So we kind of start off with her finding some man-made diamonds, which she ends up leaving behind temporarily. And there's absolutely no other way to read that scene aside from that is definitely setting something up. So the crew is currently split up, and the fact that Atlas says that she can just replace her face like a mask really reminds me of the same sort of technology that we saw Reiju use to help Sanji. Now, my first reaction to seeing Sanji drooling over Stussy and him mentioning that he remembers her from Big Mom's tea party, at first I thought that that was a low blow for Pudding, but then I remembered that Pudding actually removed some of Sanji's memories, specifically when it came to them being romantic. So it actually makes sense that Sanji is saying, "Oh, Stussy, I remember you from the tea party," as opposed to saying, "Oh, Stussy, I remember you from my wedding." Now, I think Stussy ends up foreshadowing the impending doom of the section that they're in, which is the weapon development floor, because she says that it would be a total disaster if a shockwave were to hit that floor. Oh, Stussy-sama. You mean like this? In the official translation, Stussy says, "Don't cause any vibrations," which relates more to Whitebeard's power of the Gura Gura, or now Blackbeard's power. So I'm curious if that bit of dialogue could be foreshadowing something. We get more hope for Chopper's dream of being able to cure all illnesses in the world, because we discover that Vegapunk has the capacity to grow organs, and that way people won't have to wait for transplants in the future. We learn that Lilith has a weapon that shoots bubbles out of it, which I'm pretty sure uses the same type of technology that we saw the Mark III Pacifista use for their bubble shields. So I do hope we get to see Usopp use that weapon at some point for something. But in the meantime, I do think it's kind of cool how he's the first one out of the bunch to notice a presence up ahead, even though his view is being obstructed by a giant cloud of smoke. Now, I know a lot of people were worried about Oda having Sanji potentially run into Little Boa Hancock-esque Snake and what his reaction to her would be. But thankfully, we just get York turning into stone this chapter. And the context is that she finds the Little Boa Hancock Seraphim to be adorable, to be very cute. So that kind of reaction is completely different than the type of reaction that we got from the government agents, some of whom even had their tongues sticking out. Anyway, after the explosion at the bridge, Usopp falls into the floor the same way that he fell back in Enies Lobby, and then Frankie asks if he should fire back at the Boa Seraphim, which is interesting and could prove to be very effective because, as stated by Edison, the Seraphims are likely to be weak against laser beams. And so according to what we already know regarding the command hierarchy of the Seraphims, the person who gave these orders to the Seraphims to attack CP0 and the Straw Hats has to be either a Vegapunk, or it means that Mr. J. Garcia Saturn is already in the building. Now, the person taking out the communications could still end up being Caribou, though. So I think the silhouette that Shaka sees in the monitor has to be either Caribou silhouette, Saturn silhouette, or heck, it could even end up being Einstein silhouette, the main body silhouette. Now, something interesting here is that if it does turn out to be Saturn, the one who gave these Seraphim the order, I really want to see what Lucci's reaction to that would be. Because Lucci actually says that he considers the Celestial Dragons, the Tenryubito, to be gods. And so the Gorosei are Tenryubito, right? They're Celestial Dragons. They're at the top of the Tenryubito hierarchy. So I wonder if he's going to be like, well, if this is the will of a god, then I guess I should die here. Or if that sort of instinctual, animalistic survival instinct would kick in and say, like, screw you, now I'm rebelling. And by the way, I take back what I said. Now I consider Mugiwara no Luffy to be a Yonko. And if we take Luffy and Zoro's disgusted faces as a reference to the expressions that we got from Odin and Whitebeard during the Odin flashback, what's interesting about that is that even though they were cringing due to a request, both of them actually agreed to the request in the end. So in Odin's case, he was cringing because Toki asked him if he could help her get back to Wano, and eventually that's where the two of them end up. And then Whitebeard was cringing because Odin was actually asking for permission to go with Roger. And so if we follow that logic, it's very likely that despite Luffy and Zoro not liking the idea of freeing Kaku and Lucci, they will actually end up doing so. Now, a question I've had too is, can the Seraphims actually use Haki or not? Because if they can't, well, even if they could, I feel like Zoro and Luffy, being as strong as they are, they should be good. Like, they should be okay. So if they're going to end up freeing Lucci and Kaku, I think instead of thinking about it like, oh, we're freeing them because we need help, I think a better way of thinking about it would be like, well, we're actually freeing Lucci and Kaku because we don't want to get distracted. We don't want to lose focus and spend our attention trying to protect them. So it's easier if we free them and they can sort of like move out of the way themselves. Because otherwise we'll just have to carry them around. Every section that we get with the different Straw Hat groups in this chapter, I believe, is setting something up. So if we go back to the Nami situation with the diamonds and her leaving them behind, given that we know that Caribou is on the loose and that he is also very interested in treasure, and he was described as a treasure thief back in Fishman Island before he was caught by the monster trio. He basically emptied the treasure chamber back then, and he was actually thinking of offering the treasure plus the info on Shirahoshi to that mysterious person that he wants to impress. And then also, Oda can use the diamonds as a way of expanding more on the power within Egghead or beneath Egghead, because we do know that the island runs on fire, as stated by Lilith, and we also know that in order to create diamonds, you need high temperatures and pressure. Now, when it comes to the identity of who the traitor might be, I've read a lot of people suspecting Edison recently. It is kind of suspicious that Edison was the one who gave the Seraphims the order that they are currently not obeying. Like, he was the last of the satellites to command them. I remember he gave the order and then he was being targeted and there was a huge explosion and Sanji saved him. So I'm wondering if maybe he was able to say something during the explosion that nobody heard, like an extra command. To add on to that, there are two things about Edison that I find strange. The first one is that he has like these moments, these little panels where he has these eureka moments where he's like, Eureka! Because he says he gets an idea and then he runs off to develop it, but we never actually get to see what the idea is. And then the second thing comes out of this chapter where in the beginning of the arc, when we first met Atlas, Atlas was complaining and she was mad that they didn't have enough funding. They didn't have enough money to invest in creating the type of technology and sort of like expand the experiments that they were sort of trying to conduct, that they were trying to make things. But she said, like, we don't have enough funding to do these things. And she got really upset and she ended up punching a hologram. And so I was wondering, well, you do know that you have diamonds, right? Because logic would dictate that you would be able to sell these diamonds to get more funding, unless somehow Atlas didn't know that diamonds were being produced in Egghead. Because maybe Edison is the only one who knows about the diamonds. And maybe he's trying to keep that a secret for some reason. And so with money in mind, I do want to bring attention to an aspect of Nami, and that is the importance of Nami's heritage and her connection to the ancient kingdom. I've already mentioned in another video that I strongly suspect that Nami is a member of the family of D. One of the things that gets brought up over and over again in Arlong Park is the power of Nami's smile. It's essentially what ends up saving Bellamir's life, because Bellamir had lost hope. But then she found Nami smiling, and even though the external situation was horrible, that helped Bellamir regain the will to live. And so of course we know that continuing to smile in really harsh situations is a trait of the people of the family of D. With that in mind, both Nami and Jaguar D Sol also have orange hair, so there's that. And even when Nami is about to leave to go with the Straw Hats, Pinwheel guy, Genzo, tells Luffy to promise him that he'll never do anything to take away Nami's smile. And that's also the reason why Genzo starts wearing a pinwheel in the first place, because he wants to see Nami smile. Now, Nami is, of course, part of the original three, and we still don't know much about where she came from or who her biological parents are. But we do know that the place where she was found when she was a baby was a kingdom, a place called Oikot Kingdom, which, if you spell it backwards, spells Tokyo. And so just like with Wano, if it's referencing Japan, then it has to be important for Oda. And so just like we later found out that there was a connection between Shimotsuki Village and Wano, there could also end up being a connection between the founding families of Wano and Nami's Oikot Kingdom. In addition, Nami's ability to read and navigate the weather is just not normal. I mean, a former member of the Rock's Pirates even tried kidnapping her because of that ability. It's also why Arlong was using her as well, even though he hated humans. There's a scene after Little Garden where Nami tells the crew that they have to turn the ship in the other direction, and nobody can sense anything at that time. But then a couple of moments later, they find out that if they had kept sailing in the direction that they were in, they would have ran into a massive cyclone. And Nami predicted this even though she was sick. So again, that ability is not normal. Vivi even says that it's like Nami can sense the weather with her body. There's also kind of the gag about Nami being able to beat Luffy up. And Oda has said that the reason for why this is able to happen is because Nami is able to beat up Luffy's spirit, to the point where quite recently we had a panel of Jinbei wondering if Nami had Conqueror's Haki. We've had a couple of moments where Nami appears to be sort of bursting into flames, sort of comedically as a gag. One of them is really close to the panel that I just showed you as they're leaving Wano, and then the other one is this one, which takes place in Zou. Now, normally, I would just sort of dismiss these moments as just complete gags and just sort of part of the comedy of the series. Except recently, in Egghead, in this very arc, we got this panel of Luffy that was also supposed to be half a gag, but also somewhat serious in a way, because that's an actual mode that he has. So it's all fun and games until it's not, because there's a bunch of hints of Nami potentially being special. In the SBS for volume 98, Oda revealed that if Nami were to have a devil fruit power, she would have the Goro Goro no Mi. So that's of course Enel's devil fruit. Plus, because of Nami's ability to understand and predict the weather, Oda said that if Nami were to get this devil fruit, she would be unstoppable. According to Oda, the only person capable of stopping Nami after eating the Goro Goro no Mi would be Luffy himself, probably because of his body being made out of rubber and being the natural counter to lightning. And that statement alone seems to add further validity to the idea of Logia awakenings being absolutely insane. And speaking of Nami being part of the original three, I find it interesting that Big Mom's special homies seem to represent each of the three in some way. So Prometheus is a sun god Nika, Napoleon is a sword, so there's the connection to Zoro, and then both Zeus and Hera represent lightning, which connects to Nami. And because we know that Big Mom was a former member of the Rock's Pirates, And we also know that Rox D. Sebek was diving into the taboo subjects of the world. It could be likely that under Rox's leadership, Big Mom discovered the importance of fire, swordsmanship, and electricity in connection to the ancient kingdom. And so maybe she thought, well, if I want to become king of the pirates one day, I need to have these 3 types of power. Finally, Nami has actually been referred to as being a goddess in more than one occasion. In Thriller Bark, when Sanji saves Nami, there's a moment of confusion that he has, and he's like, oh, wait a minute, is this a goddess? In Wano, Shimotsuki Yasui also calls Nami a goddess as well. And then in Zou, Nami's wearing this dress that Wanda gave her as a gift. Same thing, Sanji says, whoa, is that a goddess? Now, as she's putting the dress on, Nami actually says that she can sense that the dress was probably made for somebody really important, somebody great. And then Wanda goes on to confirm this by saying, yeah, in fact, these clothes are a national treasure of the Minks. And then she also goes on to say that exchanging clothes, trading clothing with outsiders is a sign of friendship for the Minks. So what does that mean, right? Because she's calling the dress a national treasure. And unless my memory is failing me, there's only been 2 other things, 3 things in total in the entire series that have been referred to as a national treasure. The first one is the Tamatebako box, which we found in Fishman Island, that contained the energy steroids. The second one is the national treasure of Marijoa, as described by Doflamingo. And though we still don't know what it is, according to Doflamingo, that national treasure combined with the eternal youth surgery of Law's Obi Obi no Mi, if you combine those 2 things, it's enough for somebody to rule over the world. And then the third national treasure in the series is this dress that Nami wore in Zou. And so if we look at these 3 artifacts or these 3 treasures, right, we can actually argue, or we can make the connection to the 3 of those things being connected to the ancient kingdom. And again, Wanda says that exchanging clothing with outsiders is the tradition that the Minks have to establish a friendship. So we know that Joy Boy was a friend of Sunisha, right? We know that Sun God Nika was friends with the giant elephant. And we know that Nika was referred to as the sun god, right? So could it be possible that maybe this dress that Nami wore in Zou actually belonged to an ancient princess or an ancient queen? Maybe even an actual goddess. And since we know that Nika / Joy Boy was friends with the Minks, then it would follow that this goddess was also friends with the Minks as well. And this goes back to the importance of the original 3, Luffy, Nami, and Zoro. Because at this point, we already know that there's a connection between Luffy and Sun God Nika. We also know that there's a connection between Zoro and Shimotsuki Ryuma. And by the way, another name for Ryuma was the god of the blade. He was known as the god of the blade. And so with that in mind, it would also follow that there could be a connection between Nami and an ancient weather goddess that lived in the time of the ancient kingdom. I want to put the final nail in the coffin about Nami's potential heritage being special by bringing your attention to a panel, a moment in Fishman Island that was actually posted or at least highlighted by somebody on Twitter. Their name is Daniel OP. So in Fishman Island, there's this moment where Nami approaches Shirahoshi, and the way she talks to her, the way she approaches her, is almost as if like she were her equal. And then Shirahoshi, being who she is, being Poseidon, being the king of the sea, being able to talk to the sea kings and command them, Shirahoshi says something very interesting to Nami. She says, Nami, it's strange. Even though we just met, I feel like we've been friends already. So an ancient weapon is telling Nami that she senses that there's something familiar about her. So just like Joy Boy was friends with Poseidon, that bit of dialogue from Shirahoshi makes it incredibly likely that this ancient goddess that Nami could potentially be a descendant of was also friends with Poseidon as well. One last thing, we also know that during the time skip, Bartholomew Kuma, who we know is part of a special race, sends Nami to a sky island, and there she meets Haradus, who is a wizard, or looks like one. And the thing about Haradus, or Haradus, is that he is actually a Birkin. He came from the sky island of Burka. Now, he doesn't have any wings, but according to his memory card, he came from Burka, which is also the same place that Enel is from. And so given that we know that the winged races came from the moon, and the winged races include Birkins, a good question to ask here would be, aside from learning more about weather, could there be another reason for why Kuma thought it would be a good idea to send Nami to a place where he knew she would meet somebody who is a descendant of people that came from the moon? Thank you so much for watching, guys. The chapter was essentially like a bridge chapter. It's one of these chapters that if you were binging the series, you really wouldn't think too much about. You would just read it to get to the next chapter and that's it. Unless, something gets revealed later and you have to look back at this chapter in retrospect and maybe find something a little bit more interesting. So if you were reading this in a volume, you would just be like, okay, what's next? So with that in mind, thank you so much for watching and supporting my videos as much as you do and as much as you have. I really do appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of the week. You guys take care. Catch you guys later. Bye.